There's a farmer that I know in western Wisconsin who has a huge buck mounted in his living room. It's a wide and tall 10-pointer, just a true trophy whitetail. It's the biggest buck he's ever killed in a lifetime of hunting in Wisconsin, and it's probably the biggest deer that's been killed in that neighborhood in decades. He calls it a 175-inch deer. But he's never had it scored, at least not officially. And here's the thing, he's not secretive about this buck. He's got photos of it on his phone, which he'll happily show you. He tells people the story of how he shot it if they ask. I've actually heard the story like 3 times. He's proud of the deer, and he's proud that his farm was the ground that grew it. So why not have it entered in the Boone and Crockett record books? I'm Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson, and this is the question that our hunting editor, Andrew McKean, has been wondering about for years. How many would-be record book animals are out there that have never been recorded? And do hunters just misunderstand the purpose of the record books in the first place? Hey, Andrew, can I start this by asking you a personal question?
This could go lots of different ways, but I'll take the risk.
Okay. Have you ever shot an animal that would make book, like Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young record book?
Actually, I have. I think I actually haven't measured it, but I'm pretty sure I have a Missouri whitetail that is, if I'm guessing, and I'm guessing, is like 190 inches. It's huge. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. This is exactly where I'm going with this. You didn't, so this deer you didn't have officially scored, is not officially entered in.
Nope.
Okay. Do you have any idea about the number of people or the percentage of people out there who have shot a deer like that, one that would probably qualify for the record books, but don't have it officially scored or entered in any book?
Oh, man. Well, you know that this has been like this festering question I have had for years. And really, like, not only from my example, but I hang out with lots of impressive hunters. I mean, it's just one of the great byproducts of our jobs. And so I've seen on walls and in basements and like, yeah, I've seen some outsized animals that, they beg the question, what does it score? It's kind of where we always default, right? When we're trying to talk this through with people. And they're like, I don't know. Like, why don't you know? Like, well, I don't know. I just don't care. So you find enough people like that and you start to see enough of these animals. And it's just a question I've always mused about. Like, what is this? I call it the leakage rate or, the escape of animals that are not known to the record books.
Yeah. And this question and like this interest of yours has led you to really dig deep into this in a way that I think most people don't do or haven't done. And you basically started interviewing all these people who have killed these really outstanding animals that would probably have made book, but will never be entered in a book, and kind of asked them why, and tried to get to the heart of why there are so many of these really diehard hunters out there who are just not interested in entering their animals in the record books. And I'm wondering if you could kind of take us through some of those folks that you interviewed and some of their reasonings behind why they're not really interested in having their animals officially scored.
Yeah. Actually, before I talk about the people I interviewed for this specific project, because I've wondered about it so long, I had my own ideas about what they would say. And the surprising thing about this story is very few of them cited the reason I thought they were going to cite.
Oh, interesting.
And I kind of thought at first, especially some people who are very covetous of where they hunt and how they hunt, that they didn't want the world to know that they were regularly killing these big animals. So it was it was a secret that they wanted to keep.
Right, because part of the entry is you have to enter the county of where the animal is killed, right?
Right. In fact, it's even deeper than that. If on the actual entry forms for a lot of these, you have to have a GPS coordinate.
Oh.
Now, that's not made public in the records. The records just reflect the county. But even that, countywide, as you'll hear from one of my sources, was just too much. He confirmed that suspicion about sort of secrecy. But the other people I talked to had really different reasons. And that was, I think, made the story so interesting to me, as it was everything. So yeah, I'll kind of just go through it. My buddy Jeff Johnston, you know him as well. He's an outdoor writer, lives in Oklahoma. he and I would say, kind of conform to the same thing. Like his motivation was closer to mine. And that's sort of like, I don't want to know the score because I want to think it's bigger than it is.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is, I want people to think that I'm a great hunter, if I'm being honest. I want people to know that. But, to me, it is a little bit of humbleness. People can know you're, a good hunter without actually seeing the score. And to me, when you score it, it marches into the realm of braggadocio. It marches into that ego realm where for some, reason, I kind of think it's cooler and it's neater if, people can appreciate the animal and the kind of the score goes unspoken.
The truth of the tape is like, now you know. And I think I'm kind of the same way. I think that big Missouri buck of mine is north of 190, but maybe it's closer to 180.
Yeah.
I'd much rather tell people it's a 190 when they ask without they can think the world of me rather than, it's, less than I thought. And so that was one of Jeff's takes on it.
It's almost more fun to me having people guess and not knowing for sure.
Yeah.
But the main reason is I just, I don't know, man. I just don't think it's anybody else's business in it there. But two, I don't really want another man's hands on my animal's antlers, reducing it to a number.
And it's so personal that he doesn't want to take this pretty intimate relationship with this animal that he hunted hard and killed and then make it like a public thing. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I think that also does kind of get, and need to take a little responsibility here as the editor of Outdoor Life. We publish scores of big bucks on our website through the fall nonstop because people want to know. People want to know what a deer scores, and that is just a way of kind of communicating to a reader like, okay, what kind of tier this animal is in. But if you're not going to have your story published in Outdoor Life, then yeah, to Jeff's point, why do you need to put an official score to it?
Well, Jeff described himself as a walking paradox, and he is in a lot of ways. And I think we all can recognize this. Like, he's actually has developed this thing called Trophy Scan that is this software that can calculate the score of an animal from a digital photo. He is really into trophy scoring and just the whole trophy culture.
Hell, I own a scoring system. We're scoring the largest deer tournament in Texas, and we can scan anything and digitize it and score. But I've never put that thing on my animals. One reason, because I'm too lazy to have to walk up and get them. But I've got a deer that's, pushing 190, and I've got one over 200. That's a free range whitetail that, I've had ample opportunity to score. I know James Guthrie used to walk him off us, and he always wanted to score it, and I just for some reason didn't want him to.
He admits he doesn't really conform to this, but to your point, he also talked about it's our common language. What does it score?
It's a hunter's language. It's a baseline for people that are truly, and I'll take whitetails because that's what most of the country's into. It's the language. You can say he was a good or decent 10-point. You can say he had kickers and he was massive, or you can show me a picture, or you could just say he's a 162-inch whitetail with big-ass kickers, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
So for better or for worse, it has become our kind of common language as hunters, which I think is then even more interesting why then some hunters just don't speak the language or don't want to speak the language. I interviewed this guy in Bozeman, Montana named Chad Klinkenborg. He is a big-time elk hunter, and he kind of took the same tact as Jeff. He's like, it's a really personal thing. I want to hunt the oldest, most mature animals that I can. And sometimes they're on the decline in terms of their antlers. And so he thinks the whole idea of using score as a yardstick for success is just perverse.
I don't hunt for recognition. I hunt for just a love of it. For me, it's a very personal thing, and I don't feel the need to make those sorts of things public. And I think with scoring, it seems to me, it takes some of that special part of hunting. Like if I harvest an animal, then someone's like, well, what did it score? And then if I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe 300 or something like that. And they're like, that's not that great of a bull or whatever. To me, it takes away from the whole experience, the part of it that I really love. The score, the inches never really is that big of a factor for me. For me, it's like, is this a mature animal? I mean, I killed a bull that was like 9 years old a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I never put a tape to him, but he wouldn't have scored that great, but he was just an absolute like specimen of an animal. I mean, the biggest bodied elk I've ever seen, and just, he was white as could be. His teeth were all ground down. I mean, he just was a really incredible bull, but he wouldn't have scored very good probably.
I also interviewed a buddy of mine across the Saskatchewan border north of where I live in eastern Montana. His name's Brett Maffenbeier, and he is one of the most consistently successful big buck hunters I know. Whitetail and mule deer both. Southern Saskatchewan is this just hot spot because there's no guiding, leasing, or outfitting there at all. So it's like deer have a chance to not only be super visible, but known to the resident hunters who go after them hard, and he's one who does.
I don't hunt for a trophy. I hunt for a mature deer and something that I like is unique. Like that 200 mark is a magic muley for me. I've shot 2 of them now, and they're both with muzzle loaders. That would both be in the book if I wanted. I have at least 20 that would make open young, guaranteed.
His take on it was really different and unexpected. He said, I look at the book and I recognize people's names in there. I know them from my town and province. And he's like, they're a bunch of poachers. He's like, I know. God, yeah. Really? He's like, I know how they've gotten some of those big animals. And he said, I just don't agree. I don't want to be associated with them. And so that was kind of his take, that the records maybe motivate people to do things they wouldn't have because they're so interested in getting their name in the record book, that it's a perverse incentive.
I don't even score most of mine. Like, I don't get anyone to score them. I'll just put a rough score on myself. I do it for me, not for my name in the book or anyone else. Hunting shouldn't be a competition.
And I thought that was interesting. Yeah. That's not one I had considered. Another one I had never considered was this Maine hunter, this guy named Rick Labby, and he is as down east of Maine big woods deer hunters you're ever going to meet.
I'm an avid Maine deer hunter, big time, but I do care about antler score. A lot of guys from Maine hunt the weight of a deer. I've always been more of a horn hunter.
He's also a super busy independent contractor. He's a builder, and he's a busy guy.
I entered one buck in Boone and Crockett that I shot in Iowa back in 2010. I probably got 3 or 4 other bucks that would definitely make it. I entered that one buck, and to me it was just such a pain in the butt. Everything you had to go through to get that deer entered.
What about the process was hard? Was it just the time consuming or tedious?
Getting it measured was the easiest part. I had to get the outfitter to sign. The guy that I hunted with on his land, I had to get him to sign an affidavit saying that where I shot it, and it was legal. You had to have field pictures, which, isn't a big deal. You had to get copies of all your hunting licenses. It was just quite a bit to it, and I sent it in, and then they called me back, and no, you need this, and you need that. I'm glad they do that, because I think it makes it more legit. You might get more trophies that were taken illegally if they didn't have the process that they do. So I think those guys that do score for Boone and Crockett and the way they got it set up, I think it's a great system. Like I said, from my point of view, I don't need that recognition. It doesn't make me any better of a hunter. It was my goal to get in the record book, but now that I'm in it, I really don't care about. I know that those deer make it, so that's all that really matters.
We'll be right back after the break.
I thought all of these people would be super secretive. Like, they didn't even want to talk on the record because, right, if they're not going to enter a record book buck, they also don't want their achievement to be publicized. And to my surprise, they all were excited to talk on the record and be named. And the one person who didn't want to be on the record was a friend of mine who hunts Kansas every year really hard. And he is very successful at shooting big bucks during archery season. And I asked him why he's not in the record books. He said, "Are you out of your mind? Trophy hunters these days are so mobile and they're so responsive to electronic data. He's like, every time another record book from my county or another buck from my county goes up in the record books, we get more hunting pressure. There's more interest in leasing. It's just the competition factor goes up. So he's like, oh no, I don't want where I hunt or my achievement to be publicized at all.
Yeah, he was kind of that original thought that you had of why you thought none of these hunters would want to do it for that reason. And this guy was so in on that point that he doesn't even want to be named.
Yeah, that's right.
But he told you enough that you could say that he hunts in Kansas. There's a Kansas hunter out there somewhere who's killing big deer.
Yeah, go find him.
So all these perspectives, everyone you talk to, did any of those reasonings like hit home for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff's and also Chad's, the idea that it's a personal matter, like how you hunt, where you hunt, why you hunt that deer. You do it for some internal reason, not an externally validated reason. And I don't think that's what the record book was ever intended to do. And I don't think it's what like the Boone and Crockett Club or Pope and Young or these other record book custodians intended to do. But I do think that's an unintended fact that like it's become a bit of a bragging board. And honestly, I guess I echo Jeff's. It's none of your damn business.
Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, well, let's get into that. Like, because you also interviewed the Boone and Crockett Club about all of this, and of course they rely on hunters wanting to enter their animals into their records. So what do they have to say about all this?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of talk about the idea of the records and why they exist in the first place. And so I'm going to paraphrase the Boone and Crockett Club's Justin Spring a little bit on this, but, he basically says what you can, the common knowledge of the records are not supposed to be this bragging board. They're really supposed to be this long-term data collection that can show trends in sort of herd health over the long term.
I honestly think that the biggest reason somebody wouldn't enter is probably because of a misunderstanding of what that number means, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if, it was never supposed to be a gauge of the hunt. It was never supposed to quantify the success of a hunt. And I think some people like, I don't need it in the book, or they don't care to know what it really scores. I think their big fear is it's going to reduce the quality of the hunt, and in no way is that what it's supposed to do. If a hunter understood that we were doing it for conservation and it was never supposed to be, an increase or a decrease in the quality of the hunt, I don't see why they wouldn't enter it.
So the idea for the originators of the books was let's have a benchmark here somewhere, and that's where they might be considered arbitrary, but there are, the minimum record book standards, which are, by anybody's estimation, that's a beautiful trophy, whether it's a whitetail or mule deer, an elk, a grizzly bear, a walrus. I mean, there's lots of animals in the record books. And so that was the idea that number and the size of the trophy adults is a pretty good barometer for the overall health of the herd. If an adult male can grow to an old age and at this trophy status, then that's also a pretty good indication that in terms of deer and elk, fawns are surviving.
So the biggest thing that we've continued to maintain the records for is to show, wildlife management successes and failures. A way I like to explain it to somebody, I think there is a feeling in some states that, I already have a 170 in the book. This is only a 165. I'm not going to enter it. Again, that's a misunderstanding of the purpose. If those deer used to average 170 and they now average 165, that 165 is just as important of a data point as that 170 was. If somebody wants to say, hey, there used to be bigger deer, there used to be smaller deer. I mean, we're the only data set on a continent-wide scale that can actually quantitatively analyze, like, what our wildlife population is doing. And that's why we do it. And so that's why I think if most hunters understood, if they don't care if their name's in a book, that's fine. That's never what it was about. But I feel like most of them would care that we're doing this to try to see how we're doing in the wildlife management world in the face of expanding populations and all the other factors that we're facing today.
And I get that. I really like that idea. I think you could kind of poke holes in it a little bit. But the Boone and Crockett Club's Justin Spring basically says that intention has never changed. Like, that's still why they use it. And he cited a couple of examples of of wildlife managers and biologists looking at the record books over time.
A few years back when there was a bunch of that EHD in the north, our overall whitetail entries took a big hit. Well, each individual state kind of gave their synopsis of what had happened. That was a good opportunity to say, across the Midwest, we are down, 60%. Some more good examples. Arkansas did some age structure potential manipulations, and they felt that they'd increased the age structure of their deer. They did their analysis, then they took BNC entries, and then that was able to confirm what they'd said. So it wasn't a standalone, they just used the records, but they had a hypothesis that the records analysis helped them, solidify what they thought had happened from their actions. People come in and that's my elevator speech. Well, why does it matter to enter this? Elk used to be way bigger, or Fish and Game's messing it up, or whatever their hypothesis is. I tell them, give me that data point. Let me help prove that's true or not.
Another interesting, kind of more point of contention, I thought, was the issue of symmetry and how an antlers or a rack's score, a lot of that has to do with how symmetrical it is. In other words, how the left side of the rack matches the right side of the rack. And if, a deer, for example, doesn't qualify as a non-typical, then it's penalized. There's points deducted for any sort of non-symmetrical point. But we as hunters love, we call it junk, the kickers, stickers, drop tines, we love all that stuff. So what about that? What do they have to say about that issue?
Yeah, as Brett said, nets are for fish. They're not for, trophy hunters. Reflecting that very thing.
This deer here scores 196, but it only nets out at 174. That grew that many inches of antler. He deserves that many inches of antler. I want the junk. I want the trash. I want the drop tine. I want the mature deer. I want an old deer that I know is on the way down. The Boone and Crockett scoring kind of turns me off, too, because you can get the most beautiful deer in the world, the most junk on it, but it scores out at crap.
A bunch of these sources really think that our idea of aesthetics, that symmetry, that balance that the books reward so strongly or highly is kind of wrong. That it just doesn't really make sense in the real world. And it doesn't square up with what the clubs and record keepers want to do, which is reward the oldest or recognize the oldest, most mature segment of that population. Because as Chad said, sometimes the oldest animals don't score the highest. And so the idea of symmetry, I think, is kind of the weakest link here, or the weakest argument from the record books. What Justin said is, and he's paraphrasing the founders and the originators of the record book, is those imperfections that we love that you just talked about, the drop tines and the junk and the stickers, often can be a reflection of an injury or some sort of environmental condition that created that. Maybe it was a disease, or maybe it was, as I said, an injury, something that, it's distinctive and it's cool, but that the idea of symmetry is a reflection of an environment that has created a perfect specimen. Mm-hmm. And that idea of perfection is one that, it's hard to get away from it. That's that idea of symmetry, and that's why it's rewarded so highly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can just hear all your buddies who are just scouting for those non-typical bucks, just grimacing or snickering about that.
Keep in mind, though, there are non-typical categories in the books,
True.
Which was always designed to kind of reward that freak that my buddies are after. And I am, too. I mean, I think that distinctive, singular animal is, in a lot of ways, aesthetically more interesting to me. But that was the idea of the non-typical part that does sort of reward all of this, extra.
One other thing that I thought was interesting was the willingness to enter an animal kind of based on species, right? It seems like whitetail hunters maybe are a little less likely to enter their trophy bucks on percentage versus sheep hunters who are maybe more willing to enter their, trophy ram. So talk about that a little bit. Why is there a differentiation when it comes down to species?
Yeah, that idea of leakage was, that was one of my original motivators for this story. And so I asked everybody I interviewed for this about that thing, about what percentage of record book eligible animals are not entered from their estimation, and does it matter across species? And kind of the consensus is kind of squares up with what I think too, and that is on the whitetail front, I had percentages of leakage anywhere from half to one of the sources like, oh, I would be surprised if a quarter of the eligible whitetails are entered. He's like, I go into my neighbors' houses and I see these gigantic bucks on walls. He's like, they've never even heard of the record books. They're not interested at all. But you mentioned sheep, and that was something that also Justin Spring came back to, and he said,
there's certain species that have more of a notoriety that, I think we probably see a good portion of the book caliber rams that are killed, but there's people in Wyoming that kill amazing antelope and just, we may never see one their whole life.
He thinks most of the sheep, the bighorns, the Dall sheep, the wild sheep that are shot, that are of trophy book class, get entered. And part of the reason he cited is there just aren't that many of them to begin with. It takes a lot of money and time and usually years of applying, or working up to one of these hunts. And so you kind of want to maximize your achievement too. And the record book is a really good way to do it. He also said one of the interesting things about sheep is the submissions are so complete that if you don't submit one, people start to kind of wonder why.
Oh, like they're suspicious about it.
But yeah. Because one of the things that the record book requires, and I think this is really positive, is an affidavit swearing that you did everything legal. It does a benefit of the record book that it's a public declaration that I did everything right. And so for a sheep hunter who has just poured all of this time and effort into this hunt to then not submit it raises maybe more questions than it answers.
Oh, that's interesting. Going back to I think this is my last question for you. Going back to the idea of this, record book as kind of a tool for wildlife management and gauging the habitat. The Boone and Crockett Club first published its records in 1932. Since then, we have much different technology and tools for, studying wildlife, studying habitat. I mean, from drones, trail cameras, radio, GPS collars. We have a lot more available to us than they did in 1932. Is that type of wildlife study still relevant today? Like, do we still need the record books to gauge our success in wildlife management?
Boy, that's a wonderful question. It's one I actually hadn't thought about deeply in this context, but I'd answer it two ways. One is, I think we still need it for the continuity. Like the record book still connects us with the pioneer trophy hunters of North America. And I think that's valuable, like to kind of see maybe not how the animals have changed so much, but how we have changed as hunters. But also distribution, where these animals have come from. The record books really have charted like the expansion of whitetails into like the Great Plains and elk back into kind of their historic areas in the foothills and out of the deep mountains. And so I think it's really important from that perspective. From the idea of using other tools, I mean, wouldn't it be interesting to have a record book that was based around like DNA and around and around deep subspecies of these animals? Like,
yeah,
I actually think that would be fascinating. It might answer finally one of the kind of enduring frustrations of the record book, and that has actually to do with West Coast mule deer and the division between mule deer and black-tailed deer. It's the I-5 corridor, which is maybe the most porous boundary, and you can imagine. And so I'm sure a lot of mule deer are getting registered as blacktail just from where they're killed. And DNA would be one way that could actually maybe do a more exacting job of that distribution question. I actually think the record book has a whole other purpose, and that's to kind of document the escape of these remarkable animals. And so one of the things I think is interesting, you go back and look at like elk in the White Mountains of Arizona maybe is a good example, like deep, impenetrable, just vast terrain. And the people who were able to kill those animals before there were roads and jeeps and all the technology that we now use, in some ways, those are more remarkable trophies, I think.
Yeah.
Access, we complain about it all the time, but we have excellent access these days. You know,
Yeah.
maybe it's not, we don't individually have it, but collectively we can get anywhere. And the idea of an animal getting old and escaping our attention is pretty rare. And so I do like the record books for that. It does recognize that idea of, man, this animal got away from us. That's a good thing.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited and produced by Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs. It's hosted by me, Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson. Music in this episode is by Simon Brown via APM Music. We'll be publishing a new episode every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.